Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay up to date and help the channel grow. We really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And now, on with the show. You are listening to the narrated, not the popular opinion with the one and only Gray. Greetings, opinion nerds. It is I, the one they call Gray, and today we're talking about what's hot in these streets of fire on this episode of Don't Look Back, coming up right now. Even though it might be cliche, archetype setting can be a solid foundation for storytelling, opinion nerds. People like me who play this game of film critique or criticism or whatever the hell you want to call it are usually nowhere near as smart or as insightful as we need you to believe we are. The great majority of us not being filmmakers and usually pretty far fucking removed from the industry, we come to what we do from a place of being writers, or in the case of those who create YouTubes and podcast presenters first. Because of that, we sometimes value our words and how we speak them over what we're actually talking about. But this is what we do. We create engagement with how we manipulate language, or fake the passion in our voices, or with the misleading frenzy of our edits and clever animations. And in our desperate pleas for some sliver of attention, we can sometimes lose track of what our goals should be, which is to talk about what a movie is actually trying to be and do. All of us, myself included, are just trying to find some way to differentiate our work from everyone else's so we can get those precious clicks and likes. And sometimes we forget that as long as we're sincere and we actually understand what we're doing, we don't need to reinvent the wheel to be effective. Writer-director Walter Hill's 1984 action fantasy didn't necessarily need a disclaimer to prepare the audience for its strange offerings, but the fact that it had one probably doesn't hurt. Described as existing in another time, another place in its opening text, the neon-soaked graphic novel come to life is all nitro-fueled and over-the-top romantic action. Guns, fights, rock and roll, and a doomed love story. The first chapter in the never-to-be Tom Cody trilogy is, as director Hill described, everything a teenager thinks is cool. The fashion and music might change, but being a teen is as big and loud as life gets. Every choice is made out of a desperate passion, and every heartbreak the end of the world. It's a film that wears its veneer of unsophisticated juvenility over a muscular archetypal frame. The story of a lost warrior like the drifter of the Old West or the wandering samurai making their way and looking for purpose. Of course, being born in 1942, what the then 40-something-year-old Hill considered a teenage fantasy is tied closely to the exaggerated rock and roll images of his own late 50s and early 60s experiences, as the film has a very slick-back bikers and diners look. But as dated as the references may be now, the youthful attitude is timeless, and Streets of Fire revels in a world where no one over 30 exists, and every night is filled with passion, danger, and riotous music. Okay, that's a pretty solid paragraph, probably one of the most succinct and distilled perspectives on a film I've ever written. And like all good critic speak, it manages to describe what the film is without really talking about what the film is. The people involved describe Streets of Fire as being like a comic book adaptation for which there is no source. It's a perspective drawn from both the film's visually driven narrative and its relative textual simplicity, as if written specifically to tap directly into the nervous system of the under-18 set. Names like Raven Shattuck, Ellen Aim, Billy Fishman, and Tom Cody describe the characters as much as the patent leather overalls, asymmetrical dresses, and suede overcoats that wrap the characters. Artistically, the film sits at the heart of a time crisis, a chronological collision where everything somehow stopped somewhere in the late 40s to early 50s, like the war just sucked the life out of a world that managed to somehow limp along for the next 30 years in a spiral of decay. There's no nuance. Everything feels artificial, and nothing exists as if it doesn't serve the immediate needs of the film. There's no world building, no sense that there's anything beyond what is. The foreshortened perspective afforded by youth, where every moment is as desperate as any moment in time. Okay, I promise I'll stop with the critic voice, but I think you get my point. Streets of Fire is a film built on visceral experience. It's blunt and loud and maybe a little boneheaded in its approach. It's the epitome of the kind of movie people say they hate, as well as the kind of movie that doesn't seem to get made anymore because it revels in the kind of superficial spectacle of danger we're being told teenagers are no longer attracted to. It might be too much to call the film a cartoon, but not by much. In fact, I came to the film while looking into an all-time classic anime, 1991's Bubblegum Crisis. And if you're in any way familiar with that OVA's emotion-forward combination of neon, motorcycles, and rock music, it isn't difficult to see the connection. While the film might have hit the skids at the US box office, it found a remarkably warm reception in other parts of the world, particularly Japan, where, along with Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, it went on to become incredibly influential on a certain segment of manga and anime creators who took the rock aesthetic, grafted on some cyberpunk and mecha, and created a whole new visual language for the late 80s and into the 90s. My ability to slide comfortably into this movie is no doubt due to the fact that I grew up on stuff like 80 Police Files and Armitage Third and Akira, presentations that carry more than a little bit of this film's DNA. There's a certain romance about the film that both feeds and is fed by the simplicity of its underlying perspective. All the main characters fall easily into broad categories. See, this same basic story, the dispassionate anti-hero comes into town and rescues the girl, cleans up the bad guys, and finds his spark of life before wandering off in the next adventure, can be told in any number of ways in any number of settings. While the dystopian 50s aesthetic is certainly novel, where Hill shines as the storyteller is in finding the common points of so many different versions of these character archetypes and creating a narrative where they can be combined into unified expressions. Using archetypes in this way takes a lot of pressure off the audience, which is especially useful when you're asking them to process a lot of other information at a relentless pace. No need for complex motivations and belabored backstories, that's not the point. The point is the stimulation, the experience, the visceral thrill. See, the point is the ride. The downside to all that is the simplicity of the characters left the relatively young and inexperienced cast with little to work with. This unfortunately makes the performances arguably the weakest and least convincing aspect of the film. It's difficult to tell if it's Hill's direction that pushed these performances in an attempt to keep them as raw and unpolished as possible, but they all seem to be delivered as if every word is the most important word that's ever been spoken. This is different from the visual presentation of the characters in terms of wardrobe, as each of them is easily and uniquely recognizable as filling their respective roles. But the characters have only vague, nebulous pasts, if any, and the lack of development means their presentation is entirely dependent on the performer's interpretation of the material and what notes they got from Hill. What we get is certainly enough to support the intent for the experience, but it could come across to some as blunt and hammy to a distracting degree. Beyond that minor quibble, my personal criticism is that the movie doesn't go far enough. The movie comes in at a 1984 PG, which would be a 2023 PG-13. Director Hill made the conscious choice to keep the sex and violence to a minimum, citing the film as being a kind of teenage fairy tale. In my opinion, this relative level of chastity does ultimately strip the film of some of its potential impact, but also keeps it from becoming some kind of exploitation piece. But again, this is all intentional decision-making of the same sort that governs most modern comic book adaptations. It's adolescent in its approach, but it's neither pretending to be anything more nor asking to be considered as more. What some of my peers often overlook or simply choose to ignore is that not every filmmaker's goal is to make the most idealized version of whatever they're working on, and our role shouldn't be to wonder why they didn't make the version of the film we wished existed, but to try and understand what their artistic goal was, if any, and discuss whether or not we feel the material fulfilled that intent. In that regard, I would consider this film at least an artistic success for delivering on the filmmaker's intentions, even while the value of those intentions in the filmmaker's delivery can be argued. By far, the movie's greatest strength has got to be its narrative simplicity, making way for such a uniquely engaging presentation that gets right to the heart of what it wants to be. Like a film critic talking over their own head, it can be easy to get wrapped up in trying to be literate and impressive, but in doing so, you risk losing focus on the point of whatever it is you're creating. There's nothing wrong with letting a simple, archetypal approach do the narrative heavy lifting as long as you bring a measure of sincerity to the table, and Streets of Fire is nothing if not sincere. It has a rare lack of pretension and wears the desperate heart of earnest youth on its sleeve. Honestly, it just kind of rocks, and in the end, that's all it's trying to do. No movie should need a disclaimer, and if you don't get what this movie is after the opening act, you might as well hang it up and, go watch an episode of Matlock or something. But if a part of you still remembers what it means to be young, to be brash and loud and unafraid, then maybe tonight is the night to turn it up and burn the city down. This has been the narrated, not the popular opinion. As always, I have been Gray, and if you like what you heard, you can leave a tip at our Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com/notthepopularopinion. You can follow us on Twitter at @only_Gray, and don't forget our main page at notthepopularopinion.wordpress.com, where you'll find more great articles just like this. Thanks again for listening, and remember, if you're as good to others as you are to yourself, we might just make it through this mess. See ya.